Hello and welcome to the last topic of the semester. And this topic is focused on campaigns and elections. And in this lecture, we're going to take a look at an overview of elections in the United States. So in this lecture, what are we going to be taking a look at? Well, first we're going to look at when elections take place in the United States. So you have a good idea, at least at the national level, about the election cycles. So as a voter, you can kind of know when elections take place. Then we're going to take a look at the different types of elections. We're going to learn about primary elections, general elections, and direct democracy elections. So let's go ahead and get started. So what is the purpose of elections in a democracy? Well, one of the purposes of an election is to provide a peaceful means to select those who represent the people in government. We live in a representative democracy. We live in a republic. That means that we don't go and make decisions for ourselves, but we elect people to make those decisions for us. There are other methods we could use to determine who we want to serve in our government. We could have people line up and engage in some sort of duel, right? I mean, that there could be sort of a battle between the parties, like a large debate, and we could determine who is the victor of the debate. But, when you think about those like sort of exaggerated examples of how we would select those who represent us in government, they're perhaps not the most peaceful means. If we have an elite body that's selecting people to represent us in government, that could, really sort of foster conflict. It might feel that people aren't getting enough say. So having direct elections, having the people participate directly in elections is, probably, comes closest to how we have a peaceful means to determine who we want to represent us. And I think that's why one of the many reasons why there was such outrage regarding the insurrection that took place on January 6, 2021. It's fine to peacefully protest, but once you go and you, break into, the Capitol and destroy things in the Capitol and are trying to inject yourself into the peaceful counting of the electoral ballots. I think that was one of the many reasons why people were so upset with that moment. Because in the United States, we have elections, they're peaceful, we evaluate whether or not the elections are legitimate and free from fraud. And once we determine that, in fact, they are free from fraud, then we have a process that we follow. And so, I think one of the reasons why people were so upset about that is because that is the least. What happened on January 6th was, shows what happens when you don't abide by the process of peaceful elections. There are tens of thousands of U.S. Elected officials, and that means that we have a lot of elections in the United States. In this lecture, we're going to be learning about the federal elections, electing the president, the presidential elections, and the midterm elections. But we have elections to elect those who serve us in city council, on the county boards, in our state legislatures, in our governorship. And in Wisconsin, we elect judges and we elect district attorneys. And so we have a lot of elections that take place in the United States. As it says there, elections are held at the local, state, and national level. Another purpose of elections is that they hold elected officials accountable to the public. So it's a peaceful way of selecting those who represent us. But also, if you remember back to when we talked about agency theory of representation, one theory of representation is that we elect people to serve us, but when they are not serving the interest of the people, right, when they're not thinking about the public interest or the public good, then we get an opportunity to hold them accountable. And if we don't think that they're doing their job, then we have an election, and then we can remove those people from office during a particular cycle. And so that's another purpose for elections within a democracy. All right, so there are two federal elections in the United States. One is what's known as presidential elections, and the other is known as midterm or congressional elections. We're going to be talking about those in more detail in a moment. Now, in the United States, these elections occur on a fixed date. The date is not in the Constitution, but it's set by federal law. Congress passed a law determining when that date would be. Now, since 1844, the federal election day is on the first Tuesday in November, between November 2nd and November 8th. So if the first Tuesday in November is November 1st, it cannot be on that day. It needs to be on November 8th, okay? So somewhere in between that time. The reason that the Congress passed a law designating when the federal election day was going to be is because up until 1844, and you'll recall in the Constitution that the Constitution, date's not in the Constitution, but in the Constitution it says that states will select the manner and choosing of elections, including federal elections. And so that led to a patchwork of election dates. States didn't have the election for the president, election for members of the House, election for the senators. They didn't have those on the same day. And that led to a lot of chaos. So in 1844, Congress said that enough is enough. We're going to set one day for federal elections that all states will abide by. Now you might be wondering, why Tuesday? Why not Monday? Why not Wednesday? Why not Thursday? Well, historians have looked and tried to answer this question, and what they've said is that it is a reflection of religion and agrarian life. The thinking is that if you had the election on Monday, that means that people would have to travel on Sunday, which was the Sabbath, in order to get prepared to, vote on Monday. Polling places were farther away. It was kind of a big deal to vote. And so they said, well, it can't be on Monday because it's going to interfere with the Sabbaths on Sunday. And they didn't want it on Wednesday because Wednesday was market day. That's when farmers would come and sell the things that they were growing. And so historians say that's why they settled on Tuesday. Now, keep in mind that even though we're talking about federal elections, that state and local elections often coincide with federal election days, but not always. So coming up in our congressional elections in 2022, that you'll be electing your members of the House of Representatives in Wisconsin, and also there is a Senate election. Ron Johnson is up for re-election. He's one of our two senators. But that's also going to be a time where there's going to be a governor's election. But that's not always the case. So as a voter, keep your eyes open for when the state and local elections are, because they don't always coincide with the federal elections. All right, so let's first talk about presidential elections. So presidential elections are held every 4 years. Why? Because the term of office for the president is 4 years. And just as as you all know, but just to remind you, that a president can only serve 2 4-year terms. And so the presidential election, that is the day that the president of the United States is elected. Although, of course, we know that, while we have a direct election for the president at the state level, so we know what the electoral vote, we know the outcome of the electoral vote on election day or soon after, depending on how long it takes to tally the votes and how close the election is. It's really not until, as the beginning of January, when Congress actually, of the following year, where Congress actually tallies up and accepts and certifies those electoral votes, it's then that the president is officially sort of elected. But for all practical purposes, because we use a direct election for determining our electoral votes, that we know who is elected the president, soon after the election is held on that Tuesday, the first Tuesday of every 4 years. Do keep in mind that during the presidential election, that all members of the House are also up for re-election. Why? Because their terms are 2-year terms. So every 2 years they have to be re-elected. And 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. Their term is a 6-year term for Senate. And that means that every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. So even though every 4 years we have this thing called the presidential election, keep in mind that members of Congress are also up for re-election or election on that date as well. Get ready for it. It's going to be here before you know it. I've barely gotten over the last election. Now we got to get prepped up for the next election. So the next presidential election is Tuesday, November 5th, 2024. Keep in mind that while the election for the president is conducted on that day, November 5th, that the president doesn't officially take office until January 20th at noon. And in this case, it'll be on 2025. Okay, that's when the next president will officially take office. And that's due to the 20th Amendment. The Constitution was amended to change the date for when the president actually takes office. Some things to keep in mind about the presidential elections. We know this from our last lecture, that voter turnout, the highest voter turnout is generally seen on presidential election years. Why? Well, presidential elections get a lot of media coverage. Everybody knows about them. And so there's the sense that if you're going to vote, you might as well vote in that, which is kind of ironic because the president themselves probably has the least impact. Well, I wouldn't say the least, but there are other offices at the local and state level that have just a significant impact on your lives in terms of public policy. And so it's kind of weird that a lot of people vote in the presidential election, but will sit out state and local elections when state legislatures and local city halls, city councils have actually a pretty big impact on our lives as well. So that's when we see the highest voter turnout. And also that when you're thinking about presidential re-election, presidents can serve 2 terms. And usually a sitting president, the incumbent president, usually wins re-election. So when you look historically, it's a small n, right? There's been 46 presidents. Of those 46 presidents, only 11 of the incumbents were not reelected. The most recent one was Donald Trump was not reelected for a second term, although he's eligible for another term, so he very well may run in 2024. Prior to that, there was George H.W. Bush, the first Bush. He was a one-term president as well. And so incumbent presidents have a 75% reelection rate for a second term. So just some things to keep in mind. Okay, so next type of election is the congressional elections. These congressional elections are held every 2 years. So as I said on the last slide, we will have a congressional election in 2024. It is in non-presidential years, it's called the midterm elections, okay? Because it's basically midterm. It's halfway through the presidential's term. And this is the day that all congressional elections, whether it takes place on a presidential election year or in an off year in the midterm election years, it's the day that all members of the House of Representatives are elected. Sorry about my dog in the background. And as I mentioned on the last slide, it's where 1/3 of the Senate is elected because we divide those elections up by thirds because senators serve 6 years. So the next congressional election is Tuesday, November 8th, 2022. So again, we're already in political science, in the media, we're already beginning to talk about the upcoming congressional election. And because it is midterm of the presidential term, it's known as a midterm election. On November 8th, 2022, all members of the House and 1/3 of the members of the Senate will be up for election or re-election. And so we'll get a new Congress at that time. And so right now we're in the 117th Congress. The next session of Congress, remember they're numbered every 2 years. The 118th session of Congress will start on January 3rd, 2023. Okay, so they start before the president's term, which starts on January 20th. Usually midterm elections, so not congressional elections that take place during the presidential election, but usually midterm elections see a lower level of turnout, quite significantly. If you recall from our lecture last week that voter turnout for the presidential election is usually 60%, if not a little bit higher. And so the midterm elections in 2014, that was our last. That was So 2014 midterm election had a turnout of a lot less, 36%. However, also as I mentioned last class on the last lecture, turnout for the 2018 midterms was 49%. So still not as high as the presidential years, but I mean more than 10 points higher than the 2014 midterm. And that was, we talked about that last week about how there was, a lot of anger, a lot of polarization, anger towards Trump, and, that was sort of reflected in the midterm elections. We'll see if that same trend happens in 2022 with this upcoming midterm elections. Now, things to keep in mind, often the party in control loses seats in the midterm election. Okay, that's just a trend. Okay, usually the party that's in control loses seats, and right now, the Democrats have control of all three branches. And when I say the party in control loses seats in the midterm, oftentimes we're talking about which party has control of the White House. Okay, and so let's say if a Republican is in the White House, let's say during George W. Bush's term, right? Democrats picked up seats in the midterm. It's just Americans tend to like what's known as divided government. They don't want one branch of government or all three branches of government in the hands of one party. And so the fact that since the Democrats control the House, barely the Senate, but they do control the Senate and they control the presidency, the chances of them losing seats in the midterm election is great. And the fact that they might actually lose control of the House or the Senate is also quite significant. Okay. And so right now we're looking at, indicators of whether or not how the Republicans are going to do in the midterm elections. And it seems like they're posed to do well, to take back the House, most likely take back the Senate as well. So we'll see how that plays out. Now, if you've been following the news, last week, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in a case, Dobbs versus Mississippi, that basically it dealt with a Mississippi law that says that says that you can't have an abortion after 15 weeks. So maybe you read about that in the news. But following oral arguments or during oral arguments, it became sort of apparent that the Supreme Court might overturn the landmark case Roe v. Wade that establishes that women have a constitutional right to get an abortion. And so if the Supreme Court overturns Roe, and that decision would likely come out at the end of June or July, that could have an impact on the midterm elections, right? Democrats in particular could be very angry about that happening, and that might motivate them to turn up in the midterm elections. So we'll see. Something to keep your eyes open and paying attention to. All right, let's turn our sights to different types of elections, okay? So there are, regardless of whether these are federal elections or state level elections, as a voter, there are different types of elections that you will participate in. One is known as the primary election. The other is a general election, and the third is direct democracy elections. And we'll take a look at each of these in more detail. So primary elections determine the party nominee that will run in the general election. General elections determine who gets to actually hold that office, who gets to take the office of governor or mayor or senator or president. And then direct democracy elections are elections that where people get to directly vote on proposed laws that are on the ballot, and they're up for statewide vote. Okay, so actually, let's now take a look at these different types of elections in more detail. All right, so let's start with primary elections. Now, primary elections are all about political parties, okay? In the United States, we didn't do the chapter on political parties. If you want to learn more about political parties, there's a whole chapter in your textbook on political parties. So I encourage you to read it if you want to learn more. But as you know, in the United States, we have a two-party system, and in fact, you've done a discussion on the two-party system in the last week. And, and so that means that the Democrats and the Republicans, those are the two main parties in the United States. Not that we don't have other parties. We do have other parties. And when it comes to primary elections, parties that are not the Democrats and the Republicans, but the Greens, the Libertarians, whatever political parties are out there, they also choose candidates that they want to represent their party. So primary elections are about political parties, and it's the election when members of parties choose candidates that will run in the general election. And so in a primary, that the Democrats say, okay, of the different candidates that are members of the Democratic Party, which one do we want? And so the voters who are Democrats will go and they will say, well, this is the candidate we want, or this is the candidate we want, and then whoever wins the primary becomes the candidate who's going to run against the other candidates from the other parties in the general election. And the Republicans do the same thing. The Republicans say, here are our candidates, and then they let the people vote, and whoever the Republicans voters want to run in the general election, whoever wins the primary goes on to compete in the general election. And like I said, the Libertarian Party does the same thing. The Green Party does the same thing. All parties say, have a primary and determine who they want their candidates to be who run in the general elections. Now, keep in mind, primaries do not elect people to office. Just because you win a primary doesn't mean you become the president of the United States or that you become a senator or a member of the House. Primaries just say that you are the candidate for a particular political party. Another thing I want you to keep in mind, too, is that local elections are usually what are known as nonpartisan elections. So a lot of times for local elections, for mayor or for city council, people aren't running with a party affiliation. There still will be a primary, but it's just like the two top vote getters go on to compete in the general election. So at least in Wisconsin, local elections usually are outside of parties, but there are still primaries. They're just nonpartisan primaries. Sorry if I confused things by adding that, but oh well. All right, so your textbook talks about two main different types of primaries. One is known as a closed primary, and the other is known as an open primary. And we'll talk about each of these separately. Wisconsin has an open primary system. What a closed primary system is that you must be a member of a particular party to participate in the primary. So if you're not a registered Democrat or a registered Republican or a registered Libertarian, member of the Libertarian Party or what have you, in a closed primary system, you cannot vote. You have to be a member of the party. The thinking behind a closed primary is that you really want members of the party to be selecting the party's candidate. If you're not a member of the party, why should you have a say? That's sort of the thinking behind the closed primaries. An open primary system is that all voters, regardless of party affiliation, can participate in the primary election. So you don't have to be a member of a political party to participate in the primary. And all registered voters can participate in the primary. And that's the sort of primary system that Wisconsin has. Now in Wisconsin, when on primary day, when you go, there's a ballot, and it has all of the candidates from the different political parties are on that ballot. Okay, it'll say, here are the Republican people running in the primary. Here are the Democrats. Here are the Green Party. And oftentimes primaries will include like different offices. So it could be, here are the Republicans running for the president. Here are the Republicans running for the U.S. Senate. Here are the Republicans that are running for the United States Congressional District, like the 5th Congressional District. In Wisconsin, we have an open primary system. You don't have to be a member of a party. However, you can only vote for one party. So you can't say, hey, I want the Libertarian for president, and I want the Republican for Senate, and I want the Green Party for my member of the House of Representatives, although that would be kind of a strange voter, but whatever. You've got to choose one. And so you've got to vote a straight line Republican or a straight line Democratic ticket. If you choose a Republican in one office and a Democrat in another, and you try to stick your ballot into the scanner, it'll cough it back out. It'll say, nope, can't do that. Okay? So we do have an open primary system where you don't have to be a member of the party, but you do have to vote only for one party in the primary. Now, states have caucuses. You can read about caucuses in the textbook. A lot of states are moving away from caucuses. Caucuses are where you don't go and vote for who you want to run in the general election, but you actually like meet and you like go and you meet in your gym and you caucus for who you want the candidates to be. Those are kind of falling out of favor these days because it's difficult. It's not very representative of the state. It takes a lot of time to go to a caucus, but you can read more about caucuses as a method for selecting people to serve in the run in the general election in your textbook. Okay, so general elections. General elections determine who gets to hold the actual office. Okay, so if you win your primary, then you face the other candidate from the other political party in the general election. It typically draws the most voters. A lot of people sit out primaries and just participate in the general election. So you generally have higher turnout for general elections. Just an example, this was the Wisconsin gubernatorial election in 2018. The primary was on August 14th, 2018. Scott Walker, Republican candidate, he was the incumbent. He won the Republican primary. Tony Evers, the Democratic candidate, he won the Democratic Party, the Democratic primary. And then the general election was several months later on November 6, 2018, and Tony Evers was elected to the governorship. Okay, so that's just an example of that sort of process from primary to general election. Okay, so the final election that we're going to talk about are direct democracy elections. And so a direct democracy election, you're not electing a candidate for office in a direct democracy election. Rather, it's an election that gives voters the opportunity to weigh in directly on public policy or gives an opportunity for voters to remove a candidate from office, not have to wait for when they're up for re-election, but you can actually like have a special election and remove somebody from office. The types of direct democracy elections that we're going to talk about is a ballot initiative, a referendum, and what are known as recall elections. All right, so let's start with talking about ballot initiatives. So a ballot initiative is a proposed law or policy change that's placed on the ballot by citizens or interest groups for a popular vote. It's basically a way of circumventing state legislatures. Rather than waiting for the lawmakers within a state legislature to pass a law, they basically say, nope, let's get this proposed law directly on the ballot and let the people vote on it. And usually how it gets on the ballot is petitioning, that you get so many signatures on a petition saying we'd like this initiative to show up on the ballot. And if you get enough signatures on a petition, then initiative will show up on the ballot and then people will get to vote on it. Now, in the United States, there's no national ballot initiative, right? You can't get you can't say, hey, Congress isn't taking action, so we want to, put on the ballots of all 50 states a proposed federal legislation that we want people to directly vote on. We don't have that in the United States. Some countries do. The United States does not. And not all states have ballot initiative processes. 24 states in the United States have statewide initiative processes. Wisconsin does not have this process. And at the end of the lecture, we'll talk about whether Wisconsin should. Here are some examples in 2020. These were some ballot initiatives that were that passed. So not surprisingly, marijuana and legalizing marijuana for recreational use. That's a lot of states that have initiative processes have gotten that question on the ballot. And in 2020, New Jersey, Montana, South Dakota, Arizona all legalized marijuana for recreational use. Florida raised the minimum wage to $15 to be enacted by 2026. And in Colorado, they enacted paid family and medical leave programs. So we don't have paid family medical leave at the national level, but a few states do have that. And Colorado, through the initiative process, was able to pass that in 2020. Another form of direct democracy elections is what's known as a referendum. And a referendum is a law that's proposed by the legislature, But rather than letting the legislature vote that into action, okay, to enact it and then have that law signed into law by the governor, basically the law is proposed by a legislature that's referred to the public directly for a vote of approval or rejection, okay? So it's a way for the people to, weigh in on whether they want a public policy enacted in a way that, gives them more say and doesn't depend solely on the legislature and the governor for enacting that. Wisconsin actually does have referendums. We have referendums at the lower level. So if you've ever voted, you might have had a referendum to increase a bond or to raise a bond in order to build a new gymnasium for a school or to build a new school. So a lot of times we have financial referendums. But Wisconsin also uses referendums for constitutional amendments. And so if we're going to amend our state constitution in Wisconsin, that it passes through the legislature and then it goes directly to the voters to approve. If it doesn't pass through the legislature, then it doesn't go to the voters. But if it passes through the legislature, actually has to go through 2 sessions of the Wisconsin legislature, then it goes to the voters and the voters get the final say. Another example of a direct democracy election is a recall election. And a recall election is basically if somebody's in office and you think they're doing a crappy job or that they should be removed, the recall election allows voters to remove state officials from office before their term expires. So basically you hold a special election to vote about whether or not that person should be removed from office. Wisconsin allows recalls, and you guys are probably too young to remember, but the Republican governor that preceded Tony Evers, he was subject to a recall special election. In Wisconsin, you get enough signatures, and then if you get enough signatures, that triggers a special recall election. And people were angry at Governor Scott Walker for the changes that he made to unionization through Act 10 in 2010. Sorry to bore you with all the details. And so there was a recall special election in 2012, and Scott Walker won that recall election. And so even though he was recalled, he won that recall election, and he continued as governor in Wisconsin. So just in conclusion, let's do a little critical thinking about direct democracy elections. So although there is no national initiative process, you cannot put something on the ballot in order to enact federal law. Do you think that there should be? I mean, is that something that, we've talked in this class this semester about political efficacy, the sense that that people don't feel like lawmakers are actually listen to them or care about them or enact their interests. And there does seem to be a gulf on certain public policy issues between what people want and the laws that are being passed. Here's an example. So according to Pew Research, the polling that they've done, and it was in April of 2021, they said that 60% of Americans think that marijuana should be legal for recreational use. And when you add in for medical use, it goes all the way up to 90%. 31% of people think that it should be used for medical marijuana purposes, and 60 think it should be for both medical and recreational use. Yet, even though Congress, the House, has tried to pass, federal law decriminalizing marijuana, it has not become the law of the land, and it's not likely that it will in the foreseeable future. Maybe it will. And so, hey, but if you put it towards a referendum for the people, since 60% of Americans think that, it most likely would become federal law. We think about other things like closing the gun show loophole, right? A vast majority of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, like over 70%, think that there should be a background check on all gun purchases, whether it's at a gun show or not. Yet that is not federal legislation. So what might we benefit from having an initial an initiative process at the national level? Maybe would it make sense to have federal constitutional amendments proposed by a majority of voters of the electorate rather than how it's done now, that it goes to the states? So if you want, it's very, very, very difficult to amend the United States Constitution, right? And the framers, designed it that way. But, the amendment needs to go through Congress, and then it goes to either the state legislatures or the state convention. You have to have 38 states that approve. So it's very difficult to amend the Constitution. Maybe we should should adopt something like Wisconsin. Goes through Congress, right? But then we put that question to the general voters of the United States to see whether or not they want to approve of that amendment that was passed in Congress. Just something to think about. And what do you think? Should Wisconsin join the other 24 states that use ballot initiatives? While you may not be supportive of having a national initiative, would you like Wisconsin voters to be able to sign petitions and put a policy initiative on the ballot and let the people of Wisconsin decide? What would be the benefits of doing that, and what would be the drawbacks of doing that? All right, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.